he left out many details. Apparently, they find people like me who survived paranormal attacks, then protect them in exchange for information. The house itself looked ridiculously expensive. He told us that it has a security system that causes the lights to go on whenever movement is detected. Each room will always be lit when someone is inside, and the outside has large floodlights that only go on at night whenever they detect movement. It's the first house in the district connected to the town's power station and has 10 backup generators. Mr. Brent gave us a schedule for times that we can leave the house safely from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. every day of the year. I occasionally hear the lights outside turn on. At first, it startled me, but after a couple of nights in our house, I realized just how safe we were now. I'm only ever nervous when all the lights turn on nearly instantaneously around the foundation, followed by the sound of flickering movement towards the brush. I often talk with my parents about the whole situation. They say they're just glad they can be sure that we're all safe, and that Mr. Brent and his organization were kind enough to help us. I often wonder if they're being hunted, if even Carly is being hunted. I want to ask Mr. Brent so many questions, but he disappeared after the move-in. I haven't seen the Wendigo since that night, but it's possible I may look outside one night and see it staring at us, hoping for a chance to strike. I just hope that when that time comes, our fortress will hold up, as Brent said. I'm posting this in the hopes that whoever reads this will believe me. This isn't about trying to scare you or looking for media attention. This is a warning to everybody who spends late nights out. If you see a shadowy figure in the night, do not leave the light. Do not make the same mistake I did. There's a reason some houses are abandoned, and I fear I may have awoken one of the reasons. Ever since I was young, I noticed that my shadow never mirrored my movements. I tried telling my mother and father, but of course they never believed me. They would entertain my active imagination at first, but after the first couple of times, they grew tired of it. I mean, I was 13. There were far more important things to pay attention to than my shadow, but it bugged me that my shadow was different. School wasn't any easier for me. I quickly became known as the crazy kid, and the friends that I had previously abandoned me and joined in on the teasing and bullying. I tried to act like I didn't care, but when it continued in high school, I quickly lost my patience. I went from being the crazy kid to the kid with anger issues. My parents were called in at least 2 times a week because I was involved in some type of altercation. I never really got into any type of huge trouble until the second to last day of 10th grade. We were outside playing soccer during PE class. The gym teacher walked to the back shed to put the soccer balls away, and James Stevens, a kid that had been bullying me ever since we were in 7th grade, walked up to me and asked, "So Dan, your mother charged me to shag her last night. Do you think you could ask her if she could make it free tonight?" The class snickered along with his insult, and I finally reached my breaking point. I got up to face him and was ready to punch the crap out of him when I saw my shadow moving out of the corner of my eye. James saw where my eyes were pointed and turned around just in time to see my shadow moving slowly towards him. He tried moving away, but my shadow moved even quicker and started to shrink in around his feet. I started to look around at the others to see if they saw what my shadow just did, but all of their eyes were on James. I looked back up at James and saw that his nose started to bleed. He tried to cry out, but thick globs of blood rose out of his mouth. He fell to the ground as random spots on his body started to bulge out. He finally managed to let out a scream as his ribs ripped out of his skin and shirt. His intestines and organs were exposed to the hot summer sun, and his ribs were pulled apart and broken off. There was a black liquid swimming around inside of his body, but it slowly spilled out and went back to its natural form as my shadow. Life was a bit different after that. Of course, no one could really blame me for the death of James, but the school did not feel comfortable having me around anymore. Hell, my own parents didn't feel comfortable around me. They pretty much only spoke to me when they had to. I went to a private school after that, and my shadow kept moving on its own, but didn't attack anyone else until my second year of college. I managed to make a couple of friends in college, and even met my first girlfriend, Stacy. There wasn't really anything wrong with our relationship, and I felt like we would even get married. But 6 months into our relationship, she was rear-ended by a drunk driver. She was dead before the paramedics arrived. She was still only in her first year of college. The drunk driver was able to walk away pretty much unharmed. He served a 1-year jail sentence, but I always felt like he deserved to be locked away forever. The first week after Stacy's death was by far the hardest time for me. It felt like there was a void in my heart that would never be filled again. But my shadow made it easier for me. For the first 15 days after her death, I would see a dark mass build up in the middle of my room. Slowly, it would take the form of Stacy and touch my leg. It was cold to the touch, but I could feel that it was in as much pain as I was in. At first, it scared the hell out of me. I thought it was going to kill me the same way it did to James. But it would just stand there, touching my leg for a couple of seconds before disappearing into my body. The void would slowly disappear, and I would feel a sense of peace. I wasn't happy, but I was far from sad. Basically, it just put me back into neutral, and it was just what I needed. The days would still suck, but it was at least something to look forward to. The last day of its comforting was the first night I truly felt like I was better. I still missed her, but she was more of a sad, passing thought afterward. Like I said, it didn't attack anyone after James until the second year of college, but I trusted it now. It felt like the brother I never had. The friend that would never leave me. The source of my permanent comfort and safety. I was walking around downtown with my friend at 2 in the afternoon. We finished our classes an hour ago, and we were trying to find something good to eat. We were walking past a homeless man, and his arms suddenly reached out and grabbed my ankle. I fell to the ground, and the next thing I knew, he was on top of me and whispering in my ear. "Your little helper doesn't seem to like my helper. What are you going to do about it? Why not just stay still so that my helper can enter you? He just wants to play a little." I tried to push him off me, but he wouldn't budge. My friend tried pulling him off of me as well, but the man just pushed him aside like a piece of trash. I saw his shadow moving, but it didn't move towards me. It was starting to sit down as my shadow moved towards the man and slowly slid inside of the man. He became limp after a couple of seconds, and I was able to push him off of me. He landed on his back as my friend and I watched as his neck started to jerk up and down. As the man let out a guttural scream, his neck split open and torn muscle, broken bones, and a generous amount of blood spilled out. My friend screamed and asked what the hell was going on, but I was speechless. I learned for the first time that there were others like me. Again, nobody could prove that I had anything to do with the death, but the friend ignored me after that. He even told the others in our circle, and I was alone again. But I didn't care. I finally found a new mission in life. I dropped out of college after I finished the semester and went back to my house. My parents told me they could give me a month before they would have to kick me out. It was more than enough time for me. Within a week, I found a job as a cook in a restaurant about 20 miles away. 3 weeks later, I had enough saved up for a shabby little one-bedroom apartment, as well as purchase enough groceries to survive. I knew it was better for me to avoid dealing with people, but the job still allowed me to get enough human interaction to maintain my sanity. I was finally happy, but I couldn't get the homeless man out of my thoughts. He had the same type of shadow as me, and I knew there were others out there. I just didn't know where. It's been 2 years since I started working at the restaurant. I refused to take a management position, but my pay has risen significantly. Everyone at my job loves me, and I have finally started to feel comfortable with them. I upgraded from the small apartment to a 2-bedroom house, and I managed to buy a cheap working car off of Craigslist. Everything was great, until yesterday. I was out shopping at the local furniture store for a small sofa for the living room. After I found the right one, I made the purchase and set up the delivery. As I walked outside, I saw a group of around 30 to 40 people standing around my car. They were all calmly talking, but their shadows looked to be carrying their own conversation. Nervous and slightly scared, I tried walking back to the store, but my shadow moved towards the group of people. The further apart we got, the harder it became for me to move or even breathe. As I started to feel like I was being suffocated, I gave up and walked towards the group. A woman stopped talking, looked up at me, and walked up to me. She stuck her hand out and said, "Dan, nice to finally meet you. We have been watching you. We had to make sure you weren't going to abuse your helper. Don't be scared. The purpose of this visit is to give you an offer. Free rent, free food, free drugs, or whatever else you need. In return, we clean up the filth the world produces. I mean, it's pretty much zero risk for you because your helper will..." I raised my hand up and she stopped talking. After shaking my head for a second, I asked, "What? You want me to just let my shadow kill people? What gives us the right to judge people? And why do you call it the helper?" She gave me a sad smile before saying, "They are helpers because they aren't our shadows. They don't mirror what we do. Hell, they are smarter than all of us combined. You're right. We can't be trusted to judge others, but they can. They only kill people that they know are filled with evil and hate. They allow people with even a speck of good to live. Why do you think I'm still alive? Like I said, it's a choice. She handed me a small piece of paper and said, "Call this number if you would like to join, but you only have 24 hours. After the time is up, we will count it as you declining." I tried sleeping last night, but I just couldn't reach any type of decision. After tossing and turning in my bed for 5 hours, I finally got up and looked outside. The sun was starting to rise, and a couple of cars were driving down the road. I watched a couple more cars drive by, when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A small group of shadows moving down the street. There wasn't a person around. The next car that drove past my house came to a stop. After the car didn't move for over an hour, I called the police and reported it. That was 2 hours ago. The cops arrived and 2 officers walked up to the car. One officer immediately started to talk into the two-way radio while the other stood there completely still. A couple of minutes later, another cop car showed up, along with an ambulance. The 2 paramedics had shadows, but the 4 cops did not have one. I didn't want to see anyone and walked away from the window. The cops knocked on my door and asked me if I noticed anything strange before I called them. I just told them that it stopped in front of my house and stayed still. They asked me to stay in the area until they contacted me again, and I just nodded my head as they left. Before the 4 cops got into their car, I noticed that their shadows were moving on their own. "Hi. No, you're not late at all. Please come in. Say, don't I know you from somewhere? You're one of those pretty famous reporters, right? You seem really familiar. Can I get you some tea or coffee, or would you rather get on with the interview? Sorry, I don't know how this works. I've never been interviewed before. I pretty much shut myself off from the press after those kids went missing. I didn't need that kind of attention. I suppose I'll start my story by setting the scene. The village of Turgelwyn is pretty quiet nowadays. It wasn't always so. Back in the 90s, the mayor was given a government grant to build a new school which would cater for all the small towns and hamlets in the surrounding valleys. I was fresh out of university back then, just finished my training to become a teacher, and eager to start my first professional job. So, I was thrilled to be offered a place at Turgelwyn Infant School. I could finally prove myself by doing something I loved. The dolls changed that. A thick fog had rolled over the mountains and was dribbling down into Gulwyn Valley, clinging to the top of the lake and probing at the town with slim tendrils carried on a light winter breeze. The bus had already arrived, and the children were lining up to go inside, shivering their anoraks and school jumpers. I skimmed the register and noted that all were present, except for a 5-year-old boy named Gavin Lewis. His photograph, a gap-toothed boy with straw-colour hair, grinned up at me from the paper. Reassuring myself that attendance could not always be perfect, I ushered my class indoors and, shooting one last, hopeful glance out to the white-tinged street beyond the railing, shut the door behind me. My first lessons went well. An introductory session to allow the kids to settle in and make friends on their first day, and then a reading group. The Hungry Caterpillar was a huge success, and the children left to change for gym in their respective changing rooms. I wandered outside. It was pretty chilly, and I was just debating whether or not to hold the class indoors when I heard it. A hollow, rattling noise. "Hello?" I called out, but there was no reply. But I followed the sound to the playground gate, which backed into the main road out of the town. Click, click, click. There was a little doll tied to the bars. I regarded it for a moment, a slightly misshapen object with a woolen body and a face made from some kind of white ceramic material. A tangle of gaudy yellow thread was attached to its head, and the face had a disturbingly vacant, gap-toothed smile. The face of little Gavin Lewis came to mind, and I unhooked the doll from its string gibbet. It felt odd as I turned it over in my hands, heavier than it should have been, as solid beneath the soft exterior. I took it back to the empty classroom and examined it further. There was a seam up the back which seemed deliberately loose. I tugged at it, and the doll just fell apart in my hands. Bones, small and dry, spilled out onto my desk, with a clatter which echoed the noise of running feet outside the door. I pulled my jacket over the mess just as the classroom was suddenly filled with excited children ready to play outside. My heart was pounding, and, despite the cold day, I realized that I was sweating. What the hell had I just found? "Children," I shouted, "we're going to have PE indoors today, okay?" This was met with a chorus of disappointed groans, but no objections, and they filed through into the gym hall. I arranged for one of the other teachers to keep an eye on the class, then hurried to the staff room. I found the number for Gavin's parents in the school register and dialed it. No answer. I left an urgent request for his mother to contact me, then went to tell the headmistress. I showed her the bones, and she went white. "Are they human?" she asked. I told her I had no idea. After a moment's deliberation, we phoned the police. The first officer to enter the room recoiled at the sight. "Lord above!" he cried. His colleagues turned one of the larger bones over in his hands. "They're chicken bones," he told us. I asked him if he was sure, and he told me that he'd grown up on a farm and was therefore well acquainted with animal bones. "What happens now?" asked the headmistress. "It's obvious that this is some kind of threat, or at the very least, a sick joke." The men gathered up the remains of the doll and took some of Gavin's records. I was assured that they would keep an eye on the school. True to their word, another patrol car pulled up outside the gates just as the first one left. Strangely enough, the rest of that day was fairly normal. The kids cottoned on to the mute horror being displayed by their teachers, but aside from a general air of nervousness, the schedule proceeded as normal. Eventually, the school day ended, and parents, unaware of the eerie happenings, arrived en masse to collect their children. Those left caught the bus home. We did our best to make sure that everyone got away okay, but were wary about telling anyone what had happened. We didn't want to panic, especially when we didn't know what was going on yet. I was told that the police would call me in the morning to take a statement, and that I should go home. The next morning, I checked my phone, but there was nothing from the police. I suppose I wasn't really surprised. This was 1998, post Stephen Lawrence inquiry, so the police's reputation throughout the UK was at an all-time low. Such an oversight was definitely possible in my books. I waited for an hour, but figured that if they desperately needed to contact me, they could phone the school. I arrived a little later than usual, actually meeting some of the children as the parents dropped them off. This, coupled with the patrol car now parked on the corner, reassured me for a time. It took me 15 minutes to realize that the bus had not arrived. The playground was almost empty in comparison to the previous day. I put the few kids present to work on some story writing and phoned the bus company. No, they hadn't heard from the driver. He was probably just caught in traffic on his way through the next town along. Yeah, right. I felt ill. Something awful had happened to those children. The crushing pain of guilt hit me then. I should have warned their parents the day before. I needed air and stumbled into the playground. I heard it then, the faint rattling sound. I can only describe it as like that of a bead curtain swaying in the wind. On autopilot, nausea forgotten, I wandered to the gate. Clatter, clatter, clatter. Along the fence, in neat rows of identical gibbets, hung 32 little dolls. I didn't need to look at the register. I've always been good with faces. The children smiling up at me from their desks the day before were smiling at me now, faces frozen in an elation. There was something off about their eyes though, painted in detail on the ceramic heads. The eyes told a different story. Fear, pain, and anguish registered in their expressions. Everything is a bit of a blur after that. I remember hammering on the window of the police car outside. It was about then that I saw the dolls inside, slightly larger than the child dolls, and dressed in an immaculate little police uniforms, complete with crude, yet shiny epaulets. I slammed the classroom door behind me and, no longer caring whether the children knew something was up, began to cry. What the hell had I done to deserve this? I must have passed out at some point, because I woke up on the beanbags in the reading room, with the doctor taking my pulse. I tried to speak, but my voice was a hoarse whisper. The man reassured me that the children had been taken home and that the school was closed. More patrol cars were arriving by that time. They rolled out the crime scene tape, and I think I heard a helicopter going by. I was obviously in no fit state to give an interview, but I managed to tell them everything I knew before I was taken to hospital to be treated for shock. As they escorted me to a waiting ambulance, a reporter shoved a camera in my face and tried to take a photo. A policeman shoved him back as he did so, and I was shut inside the vehicle, away from prying eyes. That almost concludes my part in this story. I quit my job and didn't leave my house for weeks following the incident, with one exception. It had been raining, and the fog outside seemed to have all but been washed away. I was listening to the local radio station when they began to jabber about a supposedly important update in the missing children case. Hikers had found the school bus, empty but intact, partway up a nearby mountain. Police were said to have closed off a nearby farmhouse and barn and weren't letting anyone through. Needless to say, I made my way up to the house. The area was heavy with reporters, and even as I parked, TV crews were setting up for the midway news bulletins. Another thing that I noticed were the chickens. Several hundred at least, roaming, apparently wild, all over the compound. A uniformed officer abruptly halted my advance, blocking the garden gate. Over his shoulder, I glimpsed forensic teams moving into the house. What the hell had they found in there? Sorry, mate, crime scene, you're not allowed in. Please, I said. You don't understand. I need to know what's happened. We'll tell the press in good time, but for now I'm going to need you to get back to the cars. I went home, but kept the television on. For most of the day, they just repeated the same arbitrary details, that the house was unoccupied, that no arrests had been made and the like. That evening, however, things changed. They played a short clip which looked to have been shot from a mobile phone, allegedly leaked footage. The cameraman is standing in a narrow hallway, which ends with a downward staircase. He then descends into the darkness, and for a moment, it looks as though the clip has ended on a black screen. Suddenly, a dim electric light snaps on and reveals a basement area with damp stone walls, floor, and ceiling. He pauses and lets the camera pan over the area. The entire room is filled with strings of what appeared to be white beads on strings as tall as the wall. The camera zooms in, and the beads become bones. But these aren't just chicken bones. They're not broken up into fragments like the bones in the dolls. It's clear what they are, and I suppress the urge to vomit. Finger bones. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, of tiny finger bones dangling from strings like a macabre curtain. The cameraman mumbles some horrified curse, and the video ends abruptly. I went up there the other week. I just got your email asking to do the interview, and it got me thinking. It's been so many years, and I wanted to see for myself. I know it's breaking and entering, but come on. I had to know what it was like. Perhaps the police missed something. They never caught anyone, and nobody ever found the rest of the remains. So, in a way, I was helping the investigation. It's not like anyone goes up there anymore. The boards across the doorframe were rotten though, and it was fairly easy to crowbar my way inside. They cut the power a few months after it had happened, so I had to rely on my torch, which narrowed my search considerably. I did find something though. I'm guessing that they never searched that coal shed behind the house. It was another cellar area, cramped and containing just a workbench and a few barrels of chicken feed. I pried one of them open and poked at the stuff inside with my crowbar. Ordinary feed mixed with a powdery white substance. I glanced over at the desk, at which sat a mortar and pestle. Inside, what appeared to be half-ground bones, though human or chicken, I could not say. I was about to leave and run to the authorities when I saw the files under the workbench. Generic plastic sleeves for keeping documents safe from the elements. They were dated, one every 5 years, with the earliest being the mid-1970s and the latest being dated in the 1990s. I flipped the latter open and tipped its contents onto the table. Photographs. Photographs of children in a playground, apparently taken from inside a car. Near the back of the pile, there was a picture of 2 police officers in a patrol car, oblivious to the presence of the photographer. The final picture was of me. Not just any picture though. I remembered exactly where I was when it was taken. Blurred by movement and partially obscured by the hand of a police officer shoving the photographer away. I could just about make out myself being bundled into the ambulance. There was one other object in the folder. A doll. It was only half finished. The face had not yet been completed. and one of the arms had not yet been fully attached. The resemblance was uncanny, however. Everything was familiar, from the brown suit right down to the stupid teddy boy hairstyle which I had in the 90s. The doll was me. No, not at all. I was glad to help. I guess sometimes we get over events by reliving them enough times. I just hope I don't get into trouble for the break-in part. You won't publish that, right? Good. What's that? A fresh photograph of me? Sure, yeah. Go ahead. Heading into my senior year of high school, I was introduced to the news that the school would be provided with the technological mistake that was the iPad. Go ahead and tell me about how I'm an Apple hater and how I'm part of the PC master race. It won't bring this anywhere. That's not what I'm here to share. This story isn't about the iPads themselves, but more so what I found on mine. About 3 weeks into my first semester, the iPads were distributed to each student of the school, and I was left with time to experiment. I wasted some of my afternoon trying out web browsers, downloading useless apps and games, and of course, dreading when I would need to write an essay on the damn thing. When it came to knowledge of the iPad's programs, I was in the dark, along with my friends. The only recommendation I received was to check out the tablet's GarageBand app, as it was improved and smart programmed. It would have taken a lot to get me legitimately interested in the device, but the idea was enough to briefly draw my attention. I loaded up the GarageBand app, ready to start my first project, to find that there were already 5 projects saved. The school had acquired the iPads from another high school, who no longer required the use of the technology. All of the iPads should have been wiped clean before the transition, so the fact that some files survived on mine was surprising. Shows how much of a good job their tech team did, I guess. There were 5 projects saved, each with the default title of My Song. They were numbered 1 through 5, and their screenshots didn't detail anything intricate or creative. When I opened the first project, My Song 1, it was more of the same. There were no loops, instruments, or anything that would piece together an actual song. It was just a voice recording with no effects or edits. I played the track from the beginning, which began with silence that continued for a few seconds. Then a voice began to speak, calm at a low volume. I had to max my speakers to hear anything that was being said, but the voice was of a boy. I couldn't put down the exact age, but he had to be at least in his teens, between 14 and 15, I'd say. As far as what the boy was saying, he was essentially talking about his experiences in school. He talked about how he was getting to know people and was a bit uneasy about the year. He talked about his classes, the different kinds of students, and some of his goals for the semester. He never mentioned his name, or anyone else's for that matter. He also never mentioned where he or his school was located. None of his words provided any essential or meaningful information. By the time the repetitive recording ended, I was convinced that some student got bored and decided to record himself ramble for about 10 minutes. I was still confused about how these files still existed, so I didn't pay much attention to the details of the first recording. Most, if not all of it, was relevant, Curiosity was still strong for me, so I went straight to the second recording in the sequence. It appeared identical to the first, a strip of unaltered, recorded voice with no other sounds. Unsurprisingly, it started and continued exactly the same. The same boy spoke more about his average school life. After hearing the voice twice, I found that it was very emotionless. He sounded very disconnected with whatever the hell he was talking about, despite the details. I never compared any of the recordings next to one another, so I can't be sure if the voice had this tone in the first. Sorry if I seem to overanalyze at points. This is the first time I've spoken about this finding in months, so I have a fair amount of ideas to speak out. I'll try to keep this as organized as possible. The boy talked about similar topics to recording 1 almost the entire way. The behavior was more strange near the end. The boy was talking again about his school life, and then he abruptly stopped speaking, as though he covered his mouth on the spot. Then he started talking to himself. Not like before where he was explaining his life. He was asking questions, and he responded to them as though they were being asked by someone else. It was easy to miss what he was saying, as he was talking very quickly near the end. I can't recall any exact words, but I do remember a few instances of, "I don't know," and "What can I do?" When the second recording ended, my attention was better focused. Recording 3 was next, of course. It sounded as though it started where the second left off, when the boy began to talk with himself. The words were still quick, and his speech mumbled frequently. After a minute or so, his speech slowed, and the words were clear. What I remember may not be 100% accurate, but then again, I don't think a perfect recount matters. "This doesn't feel as I expected it to be. I didn't think it would be easy. This is concentrated thinking. It's stressful, but it feels like a lost cause. Is it really possible seeing you? You can't expect these things to be too simple. The mind is too intricate. Are you thinking of giving up after all this progress? No, of course not. Then get a grip on yourself. You want me to be real or not? Yes, I want to see you. I dream of looking at you. I have dreams of what you might look like. Are you the same as me, or are you just a mirror of myself? That will be answered if you do your job right. Keep focused. Think. Yes, I know. I keep shaking. I can't sit." The recording then ends, making it much shorter than the rest. I was quite weirded out and hesitant to move on. Keep in mind, that conversation was one voice, only the boy. When switching roles, it sounded as though his voice was trying to be different, but there was only a small change in pitch. After trying to make sense of this finding, there was nothing to go by except the 2 recordings that remained. I wasn't greatly disturbed at this point, but it was confusing nonetheless. There are numerous reasons that these recordings could have been created, some of them understandable for that matter, but none had actual support. The most feasible idea was that the iPad belonged to a mentally disturbed student who used the device to record his fits. This still left many questions unanswered, but curiosity still overshadowed my fear. I opened the 4th recording and played it. Again, the boy was speaking with himself, asking questions and providing answers. Truth be told, I still had no clue what he was talking about in his conversation. I can't remember how it began, but I can recall most of the middle onward. Am I getting close? I have to be. I can hear you, even feel you. Why can't I see you still? It's simple. You don't truly believe. You want to, but even now you can't. I can only be visible when your mind is in the correct state. But I've done everything you've asked. I've believed. I've hid myself away. Stopped talking to others. Stayed silent in school. Even stole the meds you talked about. Nothing's helping. I'm not sure how long I can keep this up. The boy sounded very distraught by this point. Are you afraid, boy? Afraid of doing what's right for both of us? Are you afraid of me? I'm not afraid. How could I be afraid if I've done everything so far? What if you're just giving the wrong instructions? You are me, after all. I know you're afraid. I'm your subconscious. I know your emotions before you've even experienced them. Don't think of me wrong, boy. I'm the only guidance you have now. There was a silence. The boy breathed deeply, moving away from the mic at intervals. His voice returned after some time. My parents, God, they are worried. They were only trying to help me. Quiet. They were distracting you, deceiving you, and you know that. That's why they're silenced now. We did it together, and there's no turning back now. You're close, trust me. But tell me, are you willing to go to the end, to do whatever it takes to see me? Yes. Yes, I am. There was silence for another minute. When I say silence, I mean that there wasn't a single sound. No breaths, movement, or mic feedback. Just dead air. I was already on the edge of my seat, even though I had no idea what was going on. A voice returned, and I nearly threw my iPad across the room. Good, I thought so. Now, at the time, the speaker volume was still completely maxed. The voice that spoke sounded about 5 times louder than it had been all along, like it was being spoken an inch from the mic. But that's only half the reason why it scared the hell out of me. The voice was completely different to the boys, like a person who had walked into a room. Despite its volume, it was still calm, spoken softly yet powerful. It was deeper, sinister, and sent a piercing chill through my body with one sentence. Most importantly, the voice belonged to a woman. I was so jumped by the new voice that I may have missed a portion of the recording, but I listened closely again. The boy's breaths were frantic, frightened. He didn't speak for some time, but he calmed down near the end and spoke once more. My God, you're so beautiful. I was stuck with what to do next. The 2 options in my mind were to continue to the final recording or replay the 4th and determine if what I really heard near the end was legitimate. Looking back, I should have done the latter, as I might have been able to remember it all a bit better. However, my attention at the time was directed to finishing the story, to see exactly where the whole strange, eerie finding went. Of course, there was the possibility that I was being successfully scared by a group of elaborate pranksters. I was actually hoping for that by the end. The 5th recording began, and the boy's speech was nervous and jumpy. It was clear, but again, my memory may not be perfect. I don't understand. You're supposed to be a visual clone of myself, right? Why do you look this different? Why are you a girl? The new, chill-inducing female voice was still there. Subconsciously, I'm what you wanted. Do you think that's true, now that I tell you? After all, you wanted someone else. Someone beautiful, hypnotizing. I suppose so. I felt so lonely after all. There's nobody that understands me, my thoughts.
Who better to understand you than your own mind, boy? I'm here now, in front of you. You concentrated and you succeeded. Are you aware of what is next? We've been talking about it many times up to now. At this point in the recording, some of it faded at random intervals. Portions were incomplete, despite the fact that I was keeping pinpoint attention on the words. Must we... This... I can see you now. Can't we just... alone from this point? You know what needs to be done. You said it yourself. They don't understand you. They were distractions. They didn't believe. Some even laughed. And thought they pay. As the woman's voice grew loud, the recording suffered further quality issues. The static grew in the background, even as words weren't being spoken. But they don't deserve... Most of it's my fault, like you... Last time, I didn't fully believe. But I mean, not them. How could I blame you? I am you. The only reason the idea is even there is because you thought of it. Okay, you're right. Both voices stopped, and the static transitioned into a painful ringing. My volume was near muted, and the sound was still completely messing with my ears. I didn't want to silence it and miss something though. By the time the words came back, I thought I was close to bleeding from my head. The next, final portion of the recording entered with another moment of complete silence. The ringing and static ceased, and all sound halted. Then, the boy and the woman spoke up again at the same time. Believe me when I say that not a word was out of sync. I will walk into the crowd, and punishment will speak for itself. I will show no excitement, fear, despair, or arrogance. I will shed no tears, say no words, and make no expression. They would look into our eyes and see no life, a soul without a single shade of color. I will reveal no emotion. All eyes in front of me do not see. Any life that doesn't see is a wasted life. An immense, inhuman voice responded. Sweet child, are you ready? It was clear to me, none of this had made enough sense to be a joke. A few days after listening to these recordings, I started sharing them with my friends, who listened to them alone. I had no desire to listen to them all again. We tried to develop ideas as to what they could have meant, or who they belonged to. We all had our own speculations, a mental patient's ramblings, audio samplings for a strange film, an iPad owner who started a joke but went too deep. There were theories that could be possible, but didn't bring us anywhere. About another week of talk went by, and word of my bizarre finding had gotten to the principal, who then confiscated my iPad because of the reputation it had gained. Now, what happened to the iPad then was unknown to me for almost the remainder of the year. Talk of it degraded after a month, though I still thought about it often. I wasn't left sleepless over it or endlessly haunted until suicide, but it damn well frightened me, hearing those voices. I would be lying if I said I didn't have the occasional nightmare about it. Fast forward about 6 months. I had made good relations with the principal over the course of the semester, to where I almost began to consider him a close friend. We were having a casual conversation after school one day, and I brought up the case of my iPad. I brought it up as more of an inside joke, but his face turned rather serious at the subject. He sighed, thinking of the best way to explain what he was about to cover. Because we were in a private setting, he wanted to tell me why I shouldn't speak about the device much more. My school's first supply of iPads had been shipped over from another high school in Iowa, who had abandoned the program because the devices had been deemed obsolete. Even if the program ended, however, the school still keeps a usage record for every device, matching students with their assigned iPad's model number. In short, the school knows what student used what specific iPad, even after they've been shipped away. The iPad I had used belonged to a freshman in that high school. His name was never told to me. I wouldn't have revealed it anyway. The student had started the year without issue, connecting with other students, getting used to classes, etc. However, weeks into the first semester, he began to take many days off. On the rare occasions he came in, he was very detached from others, and became aggressive when anyone tried so much as speak to him. The student had no history of mental or emotional illness, and had not illustrated any violence in his past school years. After some additional time, he stopped showing up altogether. 1 month later, and he finally returned with a fully loaded handgun. He had fired a total of 13 shots in the school, killing 2 students and injuring 6 others. He used the last bullet to take his own life. Given his constant absence, his reasons for the heinous crime was unknown. The only possible lead was to question the freshman's parents. When the police arrived at the freshman's secluded, rural home, the parents were found dead in their bedroom. They were both lying in bed with their throats carved open. The bedsheets were still over their corpses. What's more is that their bodies showed signs of early decay, as though they'd been dead for at least a week. In the end, the only evidence available was the recordings, which I was first to find. Before I end, as I've already shared all I know, you might be wondering why I've titled this Wasted Life Recordings. Truth be told, the recordings had no real titles. I suppose the ending of the 5th recording continues to echo in me, like it's trying to embed its way into my head. Now I'm thankful I only heard it once.
Last summer, I flew back to my hometown for a school reunion. It had been almost 3 years since I graduated from school, and aside from close friends, I had heard nothing from the rest of my class fellows. The reunion took place at the school itself, lasting till midnight. I arrived home early that day, giving me time to catch up with my family before I headed down. At the reunion, almost everybody had turned up. There was food, drink, and plenty of time to get up to date with what's been going on with everybody's life. Boys I hadn't seen in ages gave me aggressive hugs and said things like, "Long time no see." Girls I hadn't seen in ages fussed over me in a motherly way, saying things like, "Oh my goodness, you're so grown." Then everybody went around talking to nearly everybody else, asking and answering all manner of questions. For the first 2 hours or so, some of our former teachers who still taught at the school were there, which was nice. They left before sundown. As the night drew to a close, and most people began to head home, I and a few others hung around outside the school hall. I leant against the railing and sipped lemonade while listening to the conversation. One of the girls asked about a certain boy who hadn't turned up. "He said he couldn't be bothered," explained another. "He says he's going on holiday with his uni friends or something." "Typical," someone commented, and they all began to reminisce about how antisocial that particular class fellow of ours had been. As they talked, my mind drifted off elsewhere. I tried to think of who else hadn't turned up. Among a few other absentees, one person stood out. Maisie, a tall, quiet girl who had been in many of my classes. "Hey, did any of you see Maisie Heathen?" I posed the question out of the blue. The others quietened down, registered the name, thought about it, and shook their heads. "Nah," said one of the boys. "But let's be honest, she was probably the least likely to turn up. I mean, she hardly turned up at the school some weeks." "Yeah," said one of the girls, sarcastically. "Says the guy who skipped school to play video games. At least she still got respectable grades." "Whoa, no need to get personal," the boy grinned. "Her attendance didn't really make a difference anyway. She was naturally smart." "Unlike you, right?" the girl teased him. The others continued bantering, while I thought about Maisie. It struck me that she hadn't entered my thoughts for so long. 3 years at uni, many miles away, with another set of friends in another town, had taken their toll. It felt like all the excitement of student life had made me move on from this small world, which was my old school, and in moving on, I'd forgotten so much. "Didn't she go to Oxford or something?" I heard someone ask. I tuned back into the conversation, as they were talking about Maisie. "Wouldn't surprise me. I'm pretty sure she applied there. Yeah, she got in. I remember seeing Mr. Thompson congratulating her on it." "She was odd," remarked a boy named Joe. "Nice, but sort of in her own world, you get me?" I nodded. I knew what Joe meant. "So, anybody know what she's up to now? Anybody in touch?" asked Joe. We all shrugged. "Maisie went missing last year," said a low voice a few yards away. We looked to see a man's outline standing in the darkness. He stepped into the light. It was a former classmate, David, who had been eavesdropping from the shadows. "Huh?" I looked at him stupidly, feeling suddenly cold. "She went missing last year," he repeated. "They still haven't found her." We all exchanged uncomfortable glances. "Oh, come off it, David," I heard a girl say. "Stop trying to frighten us." David came and leant against the railing beside me. "I'm really not trying to be funny," he said. "You know I'm not known for my sense of humour." It was true. David, a lanky fellow with glasses, had always been rather dry. "Honestly, that's what I heard at least. My parents told me about it around when it happened, last autumn. People were talking about it in church. Her family was stressed. Everybody was trying to console them." Nobody said anything for a while. The party had become noticeably quiet, and people were leaving by the minute. "That's weird," a girl said. "Do you know what happened? How did it happen? Where?" "I don't know the little details, but I do know that she had gone on a trip alone. Apparently she had wanted to get away from everything for a while, so she had booked some cottage in the middle of nowhere in Scotland, gone to live there by herself, and after a few days, vanished." "That's terrible," someone remarked. I don't remember who, as I was caught up in my own thoughts. Vanished? I wondered. What on earth could have happened? Shortly, the gathering dispersed, and we all went home. Joe offered me a lift, which I accepted. We hardly spoke, and when he dropped me off, we exchanged short, sincere goodbyes. Something was seriously wrong. Maisie had disappeared and not been found. That in itself was inherently a frightening thing. But I had a nagging feeling that there was something greater behind her disappearance. Something that had been building up over the years. I felt like I knew something about what might have happened, but for some strange reason, I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. I lay awake that night, trying to think back into the past. Slowly, it all came back to me, and when it did, I shivered. Maisie had joined my secondary school in year 13, the final school year. From her first day onwards, she kept to herself. She was a tall, delicately made girl with refined features. With her prominent grey eyes, dainty nose, and flaxen hair neatly bound into a single braid, most agreed she was pretty. She usually sat alone in class and spent more time gazing out the window than paying attention to the teacher. In spite of this, she got high marks in most exams, and although she hardly took part in athletics, when she did turn up, she could outrun even most boys. Over time, her reclusiveness earned her dislike from some members of her class. Her high achievement only made them resent her more. I, on the other hand, felt bad whenever I saw her, and more than a little curious to know what was up with her. She never seemed quite there. It was as if she were constantly engrossed in another, faraway dimension. At the time, I saw it as enigmatic. Now, having thought about it a bit more, I've come to the realization that her behaviour was troubling, a sign that something was troubling her and wouldn't leave her alone. But as a simple 17-year-old boy, I didn't understand these things. I sometimes told my mother about Maisie's behaviour, and she told me to be nice to her and be a gentleman. I remember one particular conversation we had. My father was at work, so it was just me and my mother in the kitchen. "Mum," I began tentatively. "Yes?" "You know that girl, Maisie?" "Of course I know her. You're always talking about her." "Well, she still hasn't made any friends. She literally doesn't talk." My mother smiled. "And?" "Well, I don't understand girls, and I just find it strange. Do you have any idea what could be the matter with her?" "Really, Daniel, there's no need to pry into people's lives like that. It's nosy." "But I'm sort of concerned, Mum," I said plaintively. "That's sweet of you, but I'm sure you don't need to worry about her. Everyone has their own problems, and I think she'd prefer to keep them to herself." I thought about what my mother said and wondered what kind of problems Maisie might have had. "Do you mean, like, family problems? Are her parents getting divorced or something?" "Could be, but I doubt it. I've met her parents, and they don't look like they're splitting anytime soon, and they seem to be really nice people." I realized that I had seen them once too. They seemed like nice people. They were the sort of gentle, charitable churchgoers who cared a lot about community and never skipped mass. Their daughter was different. I figured that whatever was on her mind was something very personal that she hid even from her family. But what could that be? My simple, masculine brain couldn't get over her mysterious sullenness. "You know," my mother suggested one day, "if you're concerned, you could go talk to her. Perhaps she just feels isolated at this new school. You never know. It might make her feel welcome here." I considered it. "I might do," I said. "Yeah, I might do, Mum." I first spoke to Maisie Heathen on the way home from school. I wasn't expecting to cross paths with her, as I just had an after-school detention. I was likely the only one at school, apart from the caretaker. It was a chilly, blue-skied evening in October, and the sun had sunk enough to slightly darken one half of the sky. The homeward path cut through farmland at the back of the school, where the path had been demarcated with low wire fences on either side to keep students out of the fields. I noticed about 200 yards ahead of me on the path was Maisie. I realized this was my chance and tried to walk faster to catch up with her, then ran. I noticed she looked downwards slightly when she walked, but she moved quickly, and I was a little out of breath when I caught up. That's when something weird happened. When I was about 5 yards behind her, panting like a hound, she heard me and turned around with such a look of fear upon her face as I won't forget. It scared the heck out of me, seeing her face tightened into that silent, wide-eyed scream. When she saw who I was, she looked with embarrassment at her feet. "I'm sorry," I said. "I didn't mean to startle you." "No," she shook her head. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Don't worry. I should learn to make a better first impression. I was running to catch up with you." "Why?" She turned fully around. "Because..." I tried to think of a reason. Eventually, I just said the truth. "Because I wanted to talk to you." We continued down the path through the fields, then exited down a lane that led down to town where I lived, and where she presumably lived. Maisie was surprisingly easy to talk to. Her manners were a little funny, but she responded to questions and even asked some about school-related stuff. I asked her how she was finding the new school. She shrugged and said, "Good." "You mean you don't actually like it?" I remarked. "No, I'm indifferent," she said, and we walked on quietly for a while before she explained. "We move around a lot. I've been to so many schools that it makes no difference to me anymore." "So, why do you move around? Is it because of your parents' work?" She completely ignored that question and said something to change the subject. I can't remember what. I just remember it took me aback how hastily she changed the subject. We eventually parted ways at a crossroad. I told her that if she should feel lonely at school, she should feel welcome to approach me. She responded with a quiet smile. It was a sweet, genuine gesture of gratitude. But something about it sent a chill through me. I could see through those eyes of hers that she knew something I didn't, and that she had been through things I couldn't fathom. It was a fragile smile, quietly haunting. I walked home, feeling glad that I had broken the ice between us. I felt like I had been a gentleman, whatever that meant. But somehow, something didn't feel right. The first occurrence that struck me as genuinely odd took place later that year. I took a job cleaning the school on Friday after school. It was a warm, quiet day in early summer, and I had the task of cleaning the theatre hall. This hall had been built sometime in the 50s and was rather grand. The seats would be full and lively whenever there were performances. On that day, I thought I was the only one there. I was carrying the vacuum cleaner to the backstage room, when suddenly the door to that room opened and a girl, white as a sheet, came out. I almost screamed. It was Maisie. She'd been in the room all along. She looked terrified, like she'd seen a ghost. "Whoa, is everything alright?" I said, laughing. She looked ready to burst into tears, then ran out of the hall, leaving me utterly confused. Suddenly, I felt afraid to enter the backstage room. What on earth was in there? What had scared us so badly? Against my instincts, I went in. There was nobody there. I checked all potential hiding spaces and turned on every light. nothing. Perplexed, I got the vacuum on and started cleaning. All the while I was in there, I had this sinking feeling in my stomach, a feeling that something bad would happen any second, that I would see something any second, and then run out of there white as a sheet. But nothing happened. I vacuumed the place and got out of there quickly. I never raised the topic with Maisie. The year wore on, and nothing of that level of weirdness happened. Many weeks later, something did happen. Not weird, disturbing. Believe it or not, Maisie was actually beginning to fit in. She made some friends. Occasionally, she would engage verbally in lessons. This turned heads, as it was strange to see someone so silent suddenly so vocal. Not that she was particularly vocal, she was still quiet and understated, but it seemed as though some mysterious shadow had shifted away from her. There was a summer concert in which she played a piano solo in front of the whole school. I applauded heartily. I gradually came to the conclusion that she had simply had some form of anxiety earlier. Then, on the last day of term, school finished early. It was a sunny day, and I had been planning on going to the cinema with some friends. Turned out they were all going to a nearby nightclub that evening. I, who hated alcohol and everything to do with it, had no intention of joining them, so I settled on having a quiet evening at home. But as I set off along the homeward path through the fields, I noticed Maisie Heathen ahead of me. Just as it had been the first time we had spoken. But it was high summer now, not autumn, and the day was cloudless, and she was at ease. "Maisie!" I called as I caught up. "Do you have a moment?" She turned and nodded. We had not spoken in a while. As we walked, the sound of crickets in the grass filled the air. "So," I said, after much anticipation, "do you like films?" "What? Do you like films?" "I don't mind them. Would you like to see one? Tonight, at the cinema?" She seemed to be considering my offer, because she smiled quietly to herself, then said yes. I expressed my gladness, and, when she asked why I was asking her, told her about my friends ditching me for a nightclub. That seemed to amuse her. Then I told her which films were on. She settled on the horror, which surprised me. Horror? Really? She didn't seem the type. "It starts at 11:30 though," I warned her. "Are you going to be able to come that late?" "Sure I can." "Then that's sorted, I suppose. Shall I pick you up?" I offered. "Please." "Where shall I pick you up from?" "My house." "I don't know where you live." On the way home, she told me where she lived. It was close to my own home. I went home and killed time until night fell. At 11, I drove my parents' car to her house. She didn't own a mobile phone, so I waited outside. All the while I waited, I felt, for no apparent reason whatsoever, a touch of dread. I had the radio on and was sitting comfortably in a car parked in a pleasant suburban neighborhood. But something outside seemed to be stirring. I kept looking out the windows, expecting to see, well, not knowing what to expect to see. But there was definitely something about the place that night which was making me uneasy. I jumped when somebody opened the car door and climbed in on the seat beside me. It was Maisie. I hadn't seen the front door of her house open. "Where do you come from?" I asked. "I could swear I never saw the front door open." "I came through the back door," she explained. it's quieter, and I don't want my parents to know that I'm going out." "Oh, right." I realised I was doing something against the parents' will. I didn't want them to worry if they found a gun, and I didn't want to be the one responsible. But I guess I had no choice. Calling it off was out of the question. The drive took 20 minutes or so, and aside from ours, there were only 5 cars in the car park. The cinema was, bizarrely, a standalone building a few hundred yards off the side of a very long 50 miles per hour road. Usually, cinemas are in the town centres or part of the shopping complexes, but this one was just a large cinema theatre with its own car park and no other buildings around for some distance. It was quite nice, really, away from everything else. The only noise usually coming from the road, but at 11:30, long after dark, it lay silent. Beyond the cinema, woods stretched on seemingly endlessly. We bought tickets and joined about 10 other viewers in the theatre. The film itself was about some demonic possession, fairly cliché, but it gave me the cheap thrill I'd paid for, and the audience screamed at least thrice. I would occasionally glance at Maisie. Something about the way she watched the film was strange. Rather than looking excited or bored or afraid, how people usually look when watching horror, she seemed intense and angry. Maybe not quite angry. It was more a look of hatred. Not obvious, but subtle and cold. I found it disconcerting, but shrugged it off, then told her I was going for a toilet break. Her expression loosened into a pleasant smile as she nodded. Alone in the men's room, I relieved myself at leisure by the urinal. It was perfectly silent and relaxing, until I noticed footsteps moving about in the corridor outside. I assumed somebody was coming to take a leak, but whoever they were didn't enter. Their footsteps sounded flappy, as if they were barefoot, and there was a lot of time between each step, suggesting that whoever it was had very long steps or legs. I washed my hands and left the toilet. There was nobody out there, strangely enough. Again, I shrugged it off and returned to the film. When it ended, Maisie and I waited until the end of the credits, by which time everybody had left. Then we made our way out to the car. "Wait, I left my pullover in the cinema," she remembered just as we reached the car. "Shall I get it for you? It's empty in there now." "No, I'll go." "Sure?" "Yeah." So I slouched in the driver's seat and watched her hurry back in search of her pullover. She was pretty brave, going in there alone. The place tended to be a bit spooky at this time. Creepily enough, mine was the only car left. I wondered if there was anyone else at all in the building with her. Anyway, I flicked the radio on and waited. She was taking a while. I began to get nervous and turned to open the door. Then I froze. I saw something alarming. In the woods behind the cinema, there was a man standing, facing me. He was far away, but I saw clearly that there was something wrong with him. First of all, he was stark naked. His pale body, wildly lean, was on full display. This began to sound alarm bells. The only rational explanation for his state of undress was that he might be an escaped mental patient, or perhaps he was a pervert. He could be dangerous, I realized. I got out of the car, and the man disappeared into the trees at once. I was getting increasingly uneasy. I decided to go find Maisie. A lone 18-year-old in an empty building at night just seemed like something bad waiting to happen. But to my relief, she came out right then, wearing the pullover. We got into the car and shut the doors. I switched the radio on and, when the silence between us lasted too long, asked her what kind of music she liked. "I don't listen to music," she said. I half expected an answer and shook my head with a laugh. "But you play it quite well." She shook her head with a smile. I switched the radio off, remembering the man I had seen. I reckoned this would be a more interesting topic. I told her what I had seen and began to regret it. She became suddenly on edge, asking me where I'd seen him. I pointed to the trees. He was no longer there. "I need to get home now." She looked me squarely in the face. "Please." "Okay." I asked no questions. I started up the car and we drove out of there in haste. We didn't talk until we had left the cinema far behind. I stole glances and saw that she was biting her nails. Something was bothering her. Something about the man's description? I had no idea. I just kept driving. Several minutes later, I stopped midway along a country lane and got out. "Why?" she asked. "Just like that. Need some fresh air." "Here?" She looked around cautiously, but we were alone. "It's nice here," I explained. "Really, you should come with me. I cycle along it with friends sometimes." Doubtfully, she joined me. We leaned against the car while looking at the fields, which lay as far as the eye could see on one side of the road. On the other side were thick woods. On that quiet, warm night, it was nice to stand out and simply gaze at the fields. In spite of her earlier unease, Maisie seemed to feel more and more comfortable where we were. Perhaps it was the pleasant view before us, or the fresh air, or perhaps it was the excitement of being out at night. Whatever it was, something made her forget whatever had frightened her. I told her about how I had once been roughly at this same spot with some friends at sunrise, and how beautiful it had been. She opened up and told me about how she was honestly finding living in this town and going to this school. We laughed a little about the antics of our French teacher, and even discussed the poetry we were studying. Occasionally, we would say nothing and simply take in the night air. During one such silence, I felt a sudden, unexplicable pang of dread. Not sure why, I turned to look back at the road. What I saw flooded me first with confusion, then utter disbelief, then relentless creeping fear. The naked man from the cinema. He was there, standing less than 100 yards away. How? How was he there already? More chilling was the question of why. What did he want? When I had first seen him, I hadn't thought much of him, besides that he might be a potentially dangerous pervert. But where he stood in the moonlight, other odd details became clear. He appeared to be very tall, perhaps somewhere between 6 and 7 feet. His body was lean to the point of starvation, but his thighs and shoulders carried disproportionate muscular bulk. There was something disturbing about his face. He looked deformed and blotched, like a plastic clown mask melted to disfigurement. Perhaps it was a mask. I couldn't tell. I think we should get in the car," I said. Huh? Why? She turned to me, and she must have seen him too, for she stiffened. Hey, come on, get in the car, quick! I began to breathe heavily. She didn't seem to hear. She looked as though she were in another dimension. I opened the door and tried to usher her inside, but she was alarmingly firm. The stalker stood still. The more I watched him, the less I thought of him as a person, and the more I thought of him as something else. There was something disturbing and inhuman about his face. His presence stank of raw, otherworldly menace. He moved. He began to sprint towards us. Maisie took off. I knew she was fast, but I'd never seen her run like she ran then. It was as though she had been maddened by pure terror and lost control. Shoot! I cried, fumbling with the car door. My hands were sweaty and felt weak, as if enfeebled by fear of the stalker. Looking back, I was shocked by waves of cold panic. He was quick. Demonically quick. There was no way she could escape from him on foot, let alone I. I overtook her in the car and called repeatedly from the window. Hearing me eventually, she got in, and I put my foot on the gas and drove like there was no tomorrow. I expected to see the stalker in the rearview mirror, but instead, I saw nothing. An empty road. It was as if he had never been there in the first place. I didn't dare say a thing throughout the drive home. My thoughts ran wild and my arms shook on the wheel. We reached our hometown in silence, and it wasn't until I stopped outside a house that she spoke. No, she whispered. Take me to your house. I don't want to go home. Sure. I was baffled, but I didn't want to fluster her by asking why. Not a problem. So we drove a few more streets to my house, entered through a back door, climbed the stairs to my room, and closed the door firmly. I drew the curtains and turned on her reading lamp. Feel free to take the bed. Don't worry, I'll sleep in the armchair. I smiled and felt so stupidly false for acting as though nothing had happened. She got under the covers without a word and hid her face in her hair. I settled down, still shaking, on my chair. Don't leave, she said. It was more of a plea, and it made something within me go soft. Trust me, I won't, I said. That's the last thing she said before, somehow, falling asleep. I sat there for hours, trying to make sense of what had happened. Something about that strange man had really shaken Maisie up, so much so that she couldn't sleep in her own home. Why not? Did she think he'd follow her there? I realized that my mother would be most dismayed if she found me with a girl in my room at night. But I was a friend, and hated to see her so afraid. I couldn't have said no. She slept a few feet before me, breathing calmly, apparently in peace. But I knew that something was troubling her. I got the terrible feeling that the weird, distorted, clown-faced man was somehow connected with her strange behaviour. No, surely not. This was a random, one-off incident, I told myself. But then, why was she so afraid of him? Why did the mere description of a skinny, naked man arouse in her immediate fear? Could she know him? How? Who the heck is he anyway? There were too many questions. My head was too tired to attempt to answer them. Eventually, from exhaustion of sitting upright, I began to doze off. I was lulled to sleep by the hum of the night breeze, the quiet whir of the fridge downstairs, and the soothing sound of footsteps. Bare skin slapping against concrete outside, slowly, as if whoever was out there had long legs. After the incident at the cinema, Maisie more or less stopped talking to me. I didn't hold it against her. I assumed she just needed time. But weeks passed and she kept silent. During the last week of school, I passed her in a corridor and we made eye contact. She forced a wry, short-lived smile. "Daniel," she spoke at last. She sighed and hurried away without finishing what she wanted to say. We finished school without ever speaking again. On the last day, I slipped my number into a locker in case she ever wanted to get in touch. She never did. The summer holidays dragged by. University began. Years passed. Before I knew it, I didn't remember much of what had happened. You'd think someone would remember things like that. But no. It was almost as if my brain was deliberately trying to erase the memories. After what David said in the reunion, things came flooding back. I revisited the archives of my memory and was frightened by what I found. I spent the following days strolling around town, thinking non-stop about the whole frightening affair, trying to understand. About a week later, I was going for a run in my hometown and crossed paths with someone I hadn't seen in years. Maisie's father. He had thinned and lost hair, but I knew him at once. He didn't notice me until I said hello, and seemed to only vaguely remember me, which was upsetting. We stood talking about what I'd been up to, uni and stuff. Then there was a silence, and I dared to mention the topic of his daughter's disappearance. "Look, Mr. Heathen, I heard very recently about Maisie. I'm devastated." He looked up at me through his old-fashioned glasses with a tragic, defeated look in his eyes. "Young man," he said softly, "this world has things in store for some people that seem so unjust, so cruel, that they test our faith in the Almighty. But we must keep faith. It's all I have now. That and Mrs. Heathen." I waited for him to carry on. Instead, he took one of my hands in his. It chilled me how old he seemed for his age. "What's troubling you, boy?" he asked. "You seem to have something on your mind." I do," I admitted. "If you wish, you may tell me. Let us go to the house of God." I didn't know what he meant until he gestured to the church. "Evil things won't follow us there." Shortly, we were seated beside one another at the old town church. It was always open and always empty, apart from Sundays when a few regulars would attend. I described to Maisie's father how I had felt concerned about his daughter and told him a lot, but I didn't mention the night at the cinema. He listened intently, sighed, and then spoke. "Mrs. Heathen can't seem to bring herself to accept it, but deep down, I know that Maisie was afraid of something. I think you will have noticed that she could be withdrawn sometimes, perhaps a bit unresponsive, as if she were not quite there." I nodded. "Well, she wasn't always like that. He reached into his breast pocket and handed me a photo. I knew at once that it was his daughter, only she was several years younger than when I'd known her. It was a school photo, and she was smiling. It was a carefree, sincere expression, untouched by any underlying anxiety. I'm not sure what it was, but something in her changed when she was 13. I think I know when it happened. You see, we lived for a short time in another part of England, in a small rural town up north. There were woods near the village that had a reputation for being unwholesome, haunted even. The place had a dark history, according to townsfolk. We were new in town and had come because of my work. Maisie didn't fear the superstitions. One night, at a sleepover, she and a few friends she had made at the local school thought it would be exciting to go walking through the woods. "What happened?" I asked. "Nothing happened." Then he hesitated. "Not at first. But things began to happen soon after." "I don't understand." "I fear that something followed her home that night. Something from those woods latched onto her and never let go." "Something?" "Something," he explained. "An evil being. A demon, if you will go that far. Whatever it was, it haunted her. And when we had left that town, it followed." He paused. "It was nothing much at first, just nightmares. Then she complained about a presence in the corner of her bedroom. This was, naturally, unsettling, but nothing came of it. We put it down to too many horror films. Then she stopped eating. She struggled sleeping. She demanded that we take down the mirrors in our house. We didn't know what to think. I got the first feelings that something unnatural was happening, but I wasn't sure. I never once saw anything unusual with my own eyes. But sometimes, I admit, I would go into a room at night and feel the hairs stand up on my neck inexplicably. She would go through phases of being extremely paranoid. Then she would have months of going back to normal completely. But whatever it was, kept coming back." "Mr. Heathen," I said, my voice shaking to my surprise. "Did she ever describe what this thing looked like?" "Never." Maisie avoided talking about it. "I don't know if it even had a visible form." I couldn't help but think of the man at the cinema. His elongated body, his hideous deformity, his strange aura of threat. I tried to remove the image from my mind. Her father carried on. "Before she vanished, Maisie rented a cottage in Scotland by the sea. She told nobody about this, apart from a university professor whom she trusted. It was a strange thing for her to do. Her family had no affiliation with Scotland, nor had she been there before. The cottage was far from any human settlements. It was as if she wanted to escape everything. It didn't make sense. Then she didn't return. Police searched the area thoroughly, but there was no trace or clue to be found, no sign of foul play. But they found something." "What?" "Her clothes. They were left in the cottage. The odd thing is that they were not strewn all over the place as you might expect. They had been neatly folded and laid on the bed." I had hoped the conversation would better help understand the mystery, but the more Maisie's father told me, the more mystified I grew. "What do you make of it all?" I asked. He replied in a hushed voice, "I think, young man, that this was something beyond our world. Grief has toughened me, but it pains me when I say this. I think that something evil lured her to that cottage, cut her off from society, and left her there, vulnerable. Then one day, as she was stranded in that obscure part of the world, it came for her." I saw the old man's eyes watering. He wept at my side for a while. I couldn't do anything. No word of consolation could have helped. He dried his eyes, and then smiled weakly. "I'm afraid I can't talk any longer," he said. "My wife will be waiting. She's not well." I thanked him and apologized many times. As he turned to leave, I called out to him. I still had his photograph. "Keep it," he said. "What? No, I couldn't take this." "You seem like a good lad," he said, coming back and putting a hand on my shoulder. "You were kind to my daughter and behaved like a gentleman. It would make me glad for you to have that photograph. Mr. Heathen, please, it's nothing. Take care, young man. Never abandon faith in the Lord." And with that, he turned and was gone. I was left standing in the church alone. Evening was coming on, and shafts of moody golden sunlight fell through the stained glass windows under the pews and carpet. I looked at the photograph in my hand. "What happened to you, Maisie?" I said aloud. "Where did you go?" For an unnerving moment, I half expected the photograph to answer me. I hurried out of there and ran home. I don't think I'll ever know what happened to Maisie Heathen. As uncomfortable as it makes me, I sometimes believe it really was a demon that was making her life a misery. I can only hope for a more rational, logical explanation. Until recently, I had a habit of keeping my dorm room door unlocked, believing, ridiculously, that someday she might come looking for me. I used to sleep with a photograph in a silver frame on the bedside table. It made me feel strangely at ease. Then, one morning, I woke up to find that somebody had entered my room overnight and stolen the photo. What unnerved me is that they took nothing else, not even the frame. The legend goes that if you sit upon the throne of the little people, you will die in 7 years. Well, almost exactly 7 years ago, 3 friends and I did just that. 2 of them died yesterday in separate incidents across the country. Back then, we were college buddies and ghost hunters. Abandoned asylums filled with asbestos, Civil War era graveyards, and haunted railroad tracks. Nothing scared us. Only one thing ever did, and that was the village of the little people. It's in Middlebury, Connecticut, not far from a restaurant called Maggie McFly's. The first semester of our senior year was ending, and on the way back from a road trip to New York, we decided to go for a ghost hunt. A website called damned Connecticut revealed the GPS coordinates of the Little People's Village, just a 20-minute detour from our route home. It was the last thing the four of us would ever do together. The village is in the middle of a forest. You may miss it because it's quite small. Doll-sized houses fill a clearing in the woods. Little pathways connect the houses to each other, and then all the pathways lead to a single point: the throne. Unlike the houses, the throne is human-sized. We read about the legend on the website. Sit upon the throne and you will die in 7 years. And one after another, we all sat upon the throne, taking pictures and joking. Since we now had 7 years to live, we might as well make the most of it. I was the third to sit, and the first two who did are dead. What scared us that day happened on the way out. As we were leaving the forest, it was a foggy night, and we all carried flashlights. As we walked, little footsteps pattered on the ground several yards behind us. Someone or something was following us. With our flashlights, we turned around and scanned the area, and then we all saw something none of us could explain. In the distance, several pairs of eyes glowed in the darkness, as if it belonged to creatures the size of a doll. And when we shone our flashlights upon them, the creatures scampered away, their footsteps pitter-pattering. Laughter, like that of children, echoed through the woods. We ran back down to the car and drove away. One of my friends claimed she got a good look, that she clearly saw a little person. I still remember Hannah's words. It had the body of a baby doll, except its hands were just fingerless stumps. All I could see of its face were round, glowing eyes. The ride home was awkward. Our other two friends reasoned the eyes belonged to forest animals, but I could tell they were shaken up, and I didn't know what to believe. Hannah didn't back down, insisting that she saw a little person, and I did my best to support her without taking sides. I think Hannah felt bad that we didn't believe her, because she stopped hanging out with us after that. It was nice to have a girl in our little group, especially one as cool as her, though after graduation, we all drifted apart anyway. One friend became an engineer, the other a doctor. Hannah, I have no idea what happened to her. She seemed to drop off the earth. And myself, I never amounted to much. Despite, or maybe because of, majoring in astronomy, I work at Starbucks. I always dreamed of becoming the next Neil deGrasse Tyson, or maybe just starting an astronomy YouTube channel. But aside from owning a few telescopes, I don't do much with my passion. If I live past this day, I promise to make something of my life. If I live. At 6 p.m. yesterday, I got a call that my doctor friend was murdered while out for a morning jog. He lived in Washington State. Then, at 9 p.m., I was informed that my engineer friend was killed while he walked home from work. He lived in Atlanta. Shocked at this turn of events, I checked the local news in each area to find out more. The description of their deaths was eerily similar. Both were found with their hands amputated and their blood drained. What are the chances? About an hour later, Hannah knocked on my door. Her auburn hair was shorter now, but her smile was just how I remembered. Most striking, she was gym fit and 25 pounds lighter than when I knew her. Back then, she was the cool girl that would hang out with the guys, but never the girl we wanted. To be honest, though I never admitted it, I always felt a sense of comfort and warmth when I was with her. We sat on the couch of my little apartment and exchanged pleasantries. "Have you heard?" she asked. "It's really sad and so sudden," I said. "I haven't had time to process it." "It's the curse. The little people are coming for us." I didn't know what to say. "Let me make you a coffee." So I used my most proficient skill and made us coffee. "I drove 4 hours to come see you," and I sipped the steaming mocha. "I was so worried that they got you too." "You could have called." "I came because we have to go back, together." "To the little people's village? If we're cursed, wouldn't going to their home make it easier for them to kill us?" "You don't know the whole story." Hannah explained. After witnessing a little person, she did a lot of research, even returning to Middlebury to speak with the locals. That land was once owned by a doll maker. The doll maker was known for creating the most lifelike dolls, and no one could figure out how he made his dolls with such a realistic appearance. It was rumoured that he prayed to an ancient pagan god to infuse his dolls with the souls of the damned, which gave them their realism. The doll maker was a perfectionist. For each doll he completed, dozens were discarded for the most minor imperfections. But unlike most doll makers, he didn't just throw the dolls away. He would cut their hands off to keep them as memento of what he had created, and bury the bodies in the forest. One day, the doll maker began to hear voices. The voices told him to build a little village, and so he did. The voices also told him to build a throne for their king. "But what exactly makes a throne cursed?" I asked. Hannah had finished the coffee and looked wired. Her eyes were bloodshot, probably from lack of sleep. "The doll maker mistakenly thought he was the king and sat upon the throne. 7 years later, he cut off the hands of his wife and daughter, drained their blood, and then slit his own throat. I even have a newspaper clipping from that event almost a century ago." "Okay, so we committed the same sin as the doll maker, and now we're cursed?" I said. "What do we do about it?" "I don't know, but we can't just wait for them to get us. That's why we have to go back and beg their forgiveness." Hannah jiggled her car keys. "You have a better plan?" Truth be told, I didn't need a reason to road trip with Hannah. During the 2-hour drive to Middlebury, we reminisced about our college days, and even joked that we could have been a couple. We talked about how funny it would have been if we were secretly dating, and none of our friends knew it. As she suggested, we could sneak a kiss when their backs were turned, or as I suggested, have a quickie behind a tree while out on one of our ghost hunts. It felt good to joke around with Hannah, despite the circumstances. Once we parked in the off-road near the forest, I felt a sudden, crippling rush of fear, as if the road trip with Hannah had been a warm dream, and I'd just awoken to the cold reality of what we were about to do. I couldn't even open the car door. My heart was pounding against my chest, and I could barely let out a breath before I had to take one in. "Let's go back," I said. "Please, let's just go home." Hannah put her arms around me. "You were the third to sit on the throne. That means you'll die before I do." She hugged me. The tears wet my cheeks. "I can't let that happen." We held hands as we walked through the forest, our flashlights illuminating the way. It was a foggy night, like the one 7 years ago, but far colder. And as we approached the village, it felt like with every step, the temperature dropped. The terror of what awaited us chilled my blood. Hannah was my strength. In her beautiful hazel eyes, there was no fear, only determination to do what must be done to save both our lives. Little eyes glowed in the dark ahead of us. I wanted to run, but Hannah tightened a grip on my hand and pulled my frozen body forward. We shined our flashlights on the eyes, and they disappeared. Only the little houses remained to be seen. And there was the throne. It towered over and faced the little houses. The throne seat was a broken mess of stone, and the back of the throne was a ruddy rectangle slab. A withered tree hung over it, its dead branches scraping the stone. Hannah dropped to her knees and bowed before the throne. "Hannah, what the hell are you doing?" She bobbed up and down and chanted something in a language I didn't understand. It sounded like backwards Latin. "Whatever you're doing, it's not funny." She kept chanting backwards Latin and bobbing her body. Something was very wrong. I turned to run. A sharp pain flared in my shin and I fell. My flashlight flew out of my hand. A little person with a knife protruding out of its stumpy hand, as if it was a finger, had stabbed me. Its body looked like a baby doll, but there was something odd about its face. Parts of it looked plastic, while the other parts were a patchwork of stapled-on human skin. It stabbed my leg again, while laughing like a child. Pangs of pain pulsed through my body. "Help!" Little eyes appeared all around me. There was someone sitting on the throne. It was too dark to see anything but his aura. Hannah was talking to him in that backwards Latin. He spoke in a hushed but deep voice that burned my ears. "Hannah!" She wouldn't even look at me. "We have to get out of here!" The man on the throne rose and walked towards me. He had no hands, only stumps. The flesh on his face barely had skin. Where his nose should have been, there were 2 holes. Around his neck hung 4 human hands, as if they were his ornaments. And he wore a crown on his head made of glittering gold. Then I saw Hannah. She wasn't 25 pounds lighter. She was a skeleton. Her pale skin on her face clung tightly to her cheekbones. Her ribs were so clear they almost poked out of her chest. And on her head was a gleaming silver crown. The next thing I remember was waking up in my bed. My work alarm had just gone off. My leg hurt like hell, but it had been bandaged and I could walk just fine. There was a letter on my bedside table. "Being with you made me so happy. I will treasure our time together forever, because where I'm going, there will be no more happy moments. The king has forgiven you. Never return and never come looking for me. Live for the both of us. Love, Hannah." I went online and researched everything I could about the Little People's Village. Aside from Damned Connecticut and a few other websites, there was nothing substantive. Judging by Hannah's letter, the less I knew about the little people and their king, the better. All I really knew was that a curse had killed my friends, and I was supposed to be next. But then Hannah saved me. I owe it to her, to live my life to the fullest, the life she gave me. I picked up one of my telescopes and wiped off the dust. One of these days, I'm definitely going to set this baby up and do some stargazing. Maybe I'll even upload a video of what I find to YouTube. But that had to wait. I put the telescope down and picked up Hannah's letter. I read the first paragraph again. Being with you made me so happy. I will treasure our time together forever, because where I'm going, there will be no more happy moments. I realized I couldn't let things end this way. Despite a warning, I'm going back to Middlebury to find her, to the little people's village, to the throne, because I know one thing for sure. I love her. After I sat on the throne, I had 7 years to live, yet in those 7 years, I barely lived. Even if I have to face the king, I will save Hannah and let her know how I feel. I won't waste my life anymore. I won't be afraid. From now on, I'll live every day like it's my last. Because today, it just might be.
I was the troublemaker in school. You know, there was always that one kid in class who never took any lessons seriously, who vandalized the classroom whenever the teacher wasn't there, who talked non-stop, despite the teacher's constant empty threats. That was me. I was very familiar with the principal by 3rd grade, whom I visited on average of 9 times per school week. My grades were low, as to be expected, but back then, I didn't care. When I say back then, I'm referring to my elementary school years, which were from 1997 to 2000, which is also where my story begins. I remember my 3rd grade teacher, Miss Darwin, who had recently suffered a divorce, and I took advantage of her at any moment I could. I would fail a test and she would always give me sympathy points. I would throw an eraser at one of the girls and I would be dismissed with a soft, "Stop, please." I recall with disdain my 4th grade teacher, Mr. Garrett, who would lower my grade by 10% every time I answered a question incorrectly in class. And then there was Miss Valerie, my 5th grade teacher. Miss Valerie was different from all the other teachers. Whereas everyone else saw me as a lost cause, she looked upon me with favour and affection. She would meet with me after class and review the material with me until she had made sure I understood it. She tutored me on weekends and motivated me to actually get work done. As you've probably guessed, my parents were rarely there for me, and she quickly became a motherly figure. I just wish I'd shown it. If anything, I was a worse student to Valerie than I was to Darwin or Garrett. I needed attention more than anything, and I think that, deep down, she knew it. Even as I talked out loud to my clique during class, even as I refused to turn in my assignments, even as I took 15-minute bathroom trips every day. I always felt guilty every time she reluctantly sent me down to the principal's office for detention, even though I wasn't conscious of it. And then, all of that changed. I think that most of you know what I'm talking about when I say that I especially hated those 20-year-old educational films. You know, the healthy eating and drug prevention campaigns that the school dropped on us for 1 month out of the year. Remember DARE? Yeah, that stuff. And the anti-bullying campaign. Jesus, that was torture. We spent the entirety of Fridays learning about how to stand up to bullies, how to not become a bully, how to speak up when you're a bystander. Of course, I never paid attention to any of it. They all consisted of grainy, low-quality scenes of people
who were clearly on antidepressants, talking about the problem of bullies in schools. They all had cheesy titles too. Don't stand by for bullying. Take bullying by the horns. I fell asleep during each and every one of them. I clearly remember that one March afternoon when Miss Valerie showed us a video simply entitled The Zebra. She inserted the tape into the VCR and told us that we should pay attention because the message was very important. She dimmed the lights and flipped on the TV. I wasn't awake for most of it, but what I did see was a bit confusing. It started with a cartoon scene of Africa, with no title sequence or anything. A poorly drawn zebra moved into view, coming across a pack of lions encircling an antelope. That's all I saw before I rolled my eyes, leaned back in my chair, and fell asleep. I was awakened by the voice of Valerie saying, "And that's why you shouldn't be a zebra. Any questions?" No one had any, but from what I'd heard at lunch that day, nobody fully understood it. Apparently, the zebra was supposed to represent a bystander. The lions were bullies and the antelopes was a victim. The plot was that the zebra watched as the lions devoured the antelope and didn't speak up to stop it. I couldn't have cared less about the message, but as the day went on, I became worried. Kids were dancing around the halls, singing happily. "We're not zebras, we're not zebras." When I threw razors at the girls, they didn't react. It would hit their face and bounce off with a slap. But they just remained, unflinching, still singing, "We're not zebras," happily. It was strange, to say the least. Before I left school, I met up with Valerie for the usual review session. As I sat down in front of her desk, she asked me why I hadn't been watching the film. My answer was standard. I didn't care. Upon hearing this, she sighed heavily. "You know, Luke," she said, "I was once a lot like you. I would constantly cause trouble in class. I would even bully other students." That was when it wasn't criminal to be one, I thought. I often picked on this one very emotional, fragile little girl. I said the meanest things to her, awful things. I laughed as I watched her cry. She even stayed home for weeks at a time. One day, I got a call that the student I'd been harassing had killed herself by jumping from a window. I was too young to understand the gravity of this admission. That moment made me realize that the path I'd chosen was wrong and hurtful. I found out later that she had left me a gift. This video. She held up a copy of The Zebra. I never understood why, but I kept it, knowing that changing would make her proud. And I say the same to you today. She put away the tape and looked into my eyes. "Now go." She hadn't assigned anything to the class that day, and I assumed she would give me at least one extra credit paper. "You're not giving me homework?" I questioned. "No, you can go home. I just wanted to tell you how I feel about your potential future," she said. I shrugged and left, seriously confused at the day's events. The next day, when I came to school, the entire class was empty. I sat down in my usual desk at the front of the room, looking at the absent desks around me. Seeing that nobody was there, I stood up and turned on the TV Valerie had kept for the PSA videos. The default channel was the local news. "Breaking news, 17 children dead, cause unknown." I stared at the screen intently, not quite knowing what to think. 17 children were found dead this morning, all outside their own homes, said a reporter. The deaths were discovered by a paperboy who insisted on remaining anonymous, who claimed that he found several of them dead, lying on the ground below open windows on his morning route. Never before, since the town was founded, has there been such a tragic occurrence. The deaths were likely coordinated, although whether the intentions were homicidal or suicidal is still unknown. Police are currently investigating the incident. Shocked, I stood up and turned around to Miss Valerie standing at the doorway. "You see why it's so important not to be a zebra now?" she said, grinning. "Of course you don't." She walked towards me. "You are special." She strolled over to her desk and took out the zebra. "These children have all stood up to the lions, and in doing so, they are no longer zebras. The antelope can be saved." She handed me the tape. I grasped it with both hands as if it were made of glass. Despite being left in the cold metal drawer, it felt warm, as if it had been lying on top of a heater. There was something else strange about it, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The antelope was killed long ago by the lion. The zebras never batted an eye. But now, both the lion and the zebras have a chance to redeem themselves. The antelope, she chose me to spread the message of this video. Only a lion possesses enough strength to persuade the horde of zebras. Now, it's your turn. Before I could speak, Miss Valerie unsheathed a knife from her pocket and swiped it across her throat, falling over her desk in a heap. I've never screamed as hard as I did that day. Within minutes, the police stormed into the classroom looking for Miss Valerie. They found me crying next to a lifeless body, still clutching the tape. I couldn't understand what was happening. I still don't fully understand, if I'm honest. They told me that she was a bad person and that she was very sad. But as they confiscated the tape, I overheard them saying bits like a known cultist, killed all 17, convinced somehow. After they calmed me down, I remember handing them the tape, saying that I wanted it back after they were done with it. Apparently that's not how it actually happened. An officer later told me that they had to pry it from me, and that I kept repeating one phrase over and over. I want to be a zebra. The case was concluded in late 2005, with the deaths confirmed as a mass suicide induced by Miss Valerie, who had a history of killing entire classes of children. Following its closing, the tape was returned to my possession, with the police officers claiming that it contained nothing of evidential interest. I knew that something about what was on it caused the death of my classmates. I had my theories: brainwashing, hypnosis, subliminal messaging, but I kept them to myself. I don't know why. I remember me taking it from them, feeling its familiar warmth, as if I was holding hands with an old friend, but I could never bring myself to rewatch it. There was something about it, something wrong. My therapist told me it was simply a connection to a traumatic event. I stopped going to his appointments years ago. At some point, I threw it in a desk drawer, and it gathered dust there for 12 years, until March 25th, the anniversary. I was spring cleaning, and I tipped over the desk, and there it was. I was tempted to pick it up and throw it into the furnace, but I restrained myself. I slowly leaned over and lifted it off the floor, brushing it off. I expected the label to be faded or worn, but it was eerily pristine. Not so much as a tear or crease. I could still see the words printed on it, appearing as though they were new. Studio 58 Productions presents The Zebra, an anti-bullying educational film. And then I realized something. That one thing I could never place when Miss Valerie had first given me the cassette. That one thing that had deterred me from watching it one more time. It was light. Too light for a cassette. The tape did not have, nor had it ever had, any film. I was happy to accept my grandmother's chore, cleaning out the small tin-roof cabin on her property. Growing up, my sister, Annie, and I would play there all the time. I've always cherished the memories. This weekend was the anniversary of my sister's death. I couldn't believe it had already been 5 years. I pulled down the long gravel drive of grandmother's rural home. As I made my way to the door, it swung open. My grandmother and uncle stepped out with luggage in hand. They were headed to the city to visit my parents. This time of the year was understandably difficult for them. As we talked for a moment, avoiding the morbid subject on our minds, my uncle's visiting indicated his desire to hit the road. Eventually, we said our quiet goodbyes. "Don't clean too much," my uncle said as he sat down in the driver's seat. "Just needs a little tidying up." I smiled softly and closed his door. As they drove away, I inhaled the fresh country air. A flood of childhood memories consumed my mind as I made my way to the cabin. It was a 2-mile hike through woods and pasture to the cabin. After what seemed like an eternity, it was in sight. I smiled as I stared at the simple structure, feeling like I'd just run into an old friend. As I climbed the hill and made my way to the porch, I heard the low rumble of thunder in the distance. The wooden door creaked open, and I was greeted with a distinct smell of dust and cedar. The cabin is simple. The front door enters into the kitchen. There is a small wood-burning stove, icebox, and a wooden table in the middle of the room. The kitchen leads into a small sitting room, complete with wicker furniture, red rug area, and fireplace in the corner. Pale yellow light filled the room through dirt-stained windows. To my surprise, my uncle left a lot of good supplies. Plenty of food, lanterns, and a hot plate for cooking. My grandmother mentioned that he had been sleeping here a lot. He and my aunt didn't have the strongest marriage. I got to work, wandering around the cabin, cleaning off all the surfaces. As I made my way back towards the entrance, I noticed something different. A painting. A large painting placed in front of a window near the door. I studied it for a few moments. It depicted an exact landscape rendition of the pond directly behind the actual window. I was confused as to why it was blocking the window. The painting was a perfect fit, covering the entire window. Tap, 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 tap. Rain pounded on the tin roof. Boom! A flash of lightning and bolt of thunder made me jump. The lightning illuminated the cabin, revealing something in the painting I hadn't seen before. I went in for a closer look and stared at the pond. There was something there, a small, round, black smudge slightly sticking out of the water in an unnatural way, different in colour and shape of the other rocks depicted in the painting. I placed 2 fingers on the canvas. It was still wet. Confused, I studied the dark liquid. I felt uneasy. I was curious to know who painted the mysterious picture and why this particular out-of-place rock was still wet. Boom! Another strike of lightning made me jump back in fright. I gathered myself and looked back. The black smudge was bigger and more defined. I shined my flashlight on the dark, wet spot. It was then I realized it was not a painting of a rock at all. It was a head, a human head, breaking the surface of the water. Dark, wet hair covered its face. I backed away. Phone in hand, I was tempted to call my grandmother and ask her who painted it, and why they felt the need to include a surfacing human head in the pond. I decided it was too late to bother her. I retreated to the sitting room, built a fire, and poured some bourbon in an attempt to get my mind off the oddity. The image was disturbing, and the thunderstorm wasn't making it any better. I covered the painting with a sheet before returning to the fire and booze. Just as I began to nod off for the night, a violent knocking jolted me awake. Bang, 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 bang! A voice screeched my name from the other side. Eddie! Eddie! The voice was unnatural, scratchy and broken, like someone who hadn't spoken in years. Paralyzed by fear, I pulled out my phone. No service. Bang, bang, bang! Let me in, Eddie! I started to shake. I grabbed the bottle of bourbon by the neck as a makeshift weapon, praying the old latch lock would hold off whatever was on the other side. I waited, unsure of what to do. Then it stopped. The voice, the knocking, all of it. I couldn't sleep that night. I sat on the floor until the pale morning sunlight crept into the cabin. Cautiously, I opened the door and crept outside. To my relief, I was alone. I ran back to my grandmother's house and gave her a call. As we spoke, I contemplated telling her of the previous night's events. I'm not sure why, but I didn't. I couldn't. The last thing I wanted to do was scare the sweet elderly woman. We spoke for a few more minutes. I sat down for an hour and reflected on the previous night. There couldn't have been anyone there, not this far out in the middle of nowhere. The storm was noisy. I must have imagined it, scaring myself like a child. I made my way back to the cabin after grabbing the old Russian rifle from my grandmother's closet, just in case. I spent the majority of the day cleaning the floors, sifting through my uncle's useless junk. I kept the painting covered with a white sheet. The sun set and the rain started again. I lit a few lanterns and just sat down to dinner. I looked back at the sheet. Near the center was a small, dark dot. I got up to investigate. Wet paint was beginning to seep through. I concluded that there must be a hole in the window, causing a leak and making the paint run. Without hesitation, I took the painting down. It weighed a ton. Once on the floor, I looked at the window. I jumped back in fright and nearly collapsed. Something was standing on the edge of the pond, with dirty, wet, dark hair covering its face. Torn and filthy clothing hung loosely from its skeletal frame, staring straight at me. I stepped out onto the old wooden porch, rifle in hand. "What do you want?" I yelled over the heavy rain pounding the tin roof. He stepped forward. "I will shoot. Don't move." The creature continued. "I swear." It continued its slow and determined pace towards me. Crack! The old rifle rang out and the bullet soared through its torso. Unaffected, it continued forward, just a few yards in front of me. Tears streaming down my face, I worked the bolt and loaded my next round. Crack! The bullet soared right through its head, as if made of air. The creature remained unharmed, as the bullet splashed in the pond behind it. I sat, defeated, knowing now there was nothing I could do. Pleading with this hideous nightmare to leave me alone, attempting to cope with my remaining sanity. It walked straight past me. The smell of rot and damp moss filled my nose as it passed. It entered into the living room of the cabin, leaving black, thick, oily footprints in its wake. The creature stood on the rug, dripping black water into the fabric. Head down, it stared intently at the rug for what seemed like an eternity. After a few moments, I attempted to speak, and it looked right at me. I gasped as I stared at the grisly, haunting apparition of my deceased older sibling. My sister's cold white eyes stared straight into mine with a look of recognition and fear. Then she vanished and I lost consciousness. I woke up on the floor the following morning. The first light of dawn filled the room. Within an instant, I remembered the terrifying events of the prior evening. I rushed over to the rug, still damp and dark in the spot where she was standing. The pungent, rotten smell lingered in the room. I pulled back the rug. Directly below the dark spot were brand new floorboards, crooked and loose. I grabbed a crowbar and uprooted the loose flooring, revealing a makeshift storage space dug into the earth. Inside was a small black duffel bag. A bag which contents changed everything. After rummaging through the bag, I realized it belonged to my uncle. I ran back to my car and drove to the nearest police station. A detective and I sat and discussed the contents of his duffel. Numerous pictures of my sister, a lock of her hair, his incriminating diary of twisted entries expressing his love for his own niece. And finally, brake lines and hoses. Lines and hoses that belonged to her car. Lines and hoses that explained the police report of my sister's accident 5 years ago, stating, quote, "Victim's vehicle contained excessively corroded brake lines. Failure to properly brake likely the cause of the accident." The evidence put him in prison for life. As for the painting, it currently hangs in my home. no wet spots or human heads. A beautiful painting created by my sister just a few months before her death. I witnessed something in the emergency room that has haunted me every day. I have not shared this with anyone until now. I woke up with a pounding headache and a dry mouth, not an uncommon morning condition for my college days. I looked around the unfamiliar bedroom until I found my phone. It was 11 a.m. on Sunday. I sat on the edge of the bed and began to put my clothes on. I noticed I was not alone. My heart started to race as I attempted to recall the previous night's drunken events. To my relief, I recognized the girl next to me as one of my friends as she rolled over in discomfort from the sunlight. I grabbed my shoes and started to put it on. Something was wrong. White hot pain shot up my leg as the inside of my shoe made contact with my big toe. I winced as I forced the Nike sneaker over my swollen foot. I threw my jacket on and made my way to the door. I immediately fell to the floor as soon as I put pressure on my right foot. I heard a burst of laughter from the girl behind me. "Still a little drunk, eh?" I replied, "No, my foot is killing me. I think something is wrong." "What did you do to it? You were fine last night when you were running around downtown," she asked. I recalled the memory of the previous day. "Oh, damn, I was running? I got my big toenail removed because of that soccer injury from the intramural game. The doctor told me to take it easy. I must have not thought about it after I was drinking. My foot was still numb from the anesthetic." "Ouch. Well, go home and take care of it," she said. I sighed and said goodbye and left. Being a dumb college kid, I limped the entire 2 miles back to the shack my college roommates and I called home. I immediately sat down and started drinking to curb the hangover. It wasn't until later that night someone decided to talk some sense into me. We had some friends over, and one girl, who happened to be a pre-med, noticed my limping. "What happened to you?" she asked. I had a minor surgery on my foot, and it just hurts. I could barely put my shoe on this morning," I replied. She got a closer look at my leg. "Oh my God, you need to go to the hospital. You see those red streaks running up your leg? That's blood poisoning." She grabbed my arm and rushed me to a car. She was nice enough to drop me off at the front door of the ER. Half drunk, I limped inside and was immediately wheeled back to a room. This began the strangest night of my life. The ER of the university hospital was especially crowded. I was put into a room that was already occupied, with a plastic curtain separating me from the other patients. The occupants of the room caught my attention. There was an unconscious man on the other bed, stiff as a board and drained of all colour. Next to his bed was a woman, extremely thin, with a sunken face and tattered grey hair, and looked like she hadn't slept in years. She sat frozen in her chair. Sitting in front of the couple was a tall male nurse, an EMT, and a police officer. The woman gazed forward with a blank stare as the cop spoke to her. "Ma'am, you need to tell us what your boyfriend took. He is going to die, but we may be able to save him if you just tell us. We want to hear it in English. Can you do that?" The woman didn't respond. The interrogation went on like that for a while, and the woman continued to stare forward with her unwavering gaze. Finally, my nurse came back in to hook up an IV to me. She spoke. "This should help with the infection and will help sew you up a bit." I looked at her and she winked at me. She leaned in and whispered to me, "Sorry about the patients next to us. Try and ignore them if you can." She returned to a normal volume. "The hospital is pretty crazy tonight, so the resident doctor wants me to work on getting this infection out of your foot. You're lucky this didn't reach your lymph nodes. Sepsis is no joke. I'm going to have to make an incision on your toe and drain out the infection. I'll numb you with a local anesthetic first." I grimaced as she stuck the long needle into my toe. "I'll be back in 15 minutes when you're numb," the nurse said as she left. I looked out to the hall as she walked out. I noticed another police officer just outside, and he was talking with a priest. It was not uncommon to see priests around campus. The university was Catholic. But I found it strange that he was right outside my hospital room. The man in the bed next to me had not moved. Maybe he was going to die and they were going to read him his last rites. My heart was racing. I had never witnessed a death before. I turned my gaze from the hall to the curtain next to me. Just behind it was the strange woman, but she was now staring directly at me with her dull, grey eyes. I quickly turned away from her. I felt eyes pierce through me as an icy shiver crept down my spine. My nurse returned and started setting up a prep table. She sterilized the scalpel and my toe and began cutting. I couldn't look. I'm not very good with that sort of thing. Without thinking, I turned my head to the right again. The woman was still staring at me. As soon as our eyes met, I had the strangest vision. It was like I started